Great, thanks, Alicia. So hi, everybody. My name is Brendan Tansey. I'm on the security research team here at Lancope. And I'd just kind of like to preemptively apologize a little bit. I'm glad to be able to say I'm kind of on the tail end of a cold, but not quite there yet. So you might hear me duck out every here and then just to mute. But apart from that, I'm all good to go. Javvad?
Cool, thanks Brendan. Hi everyone, I'm Javvad Malik, and unlike Brendan, I'm not suffering from a cold or anything. The weather's getting pleasantly warmer here in London where I am today, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, and on the bright side, I guess you can't really get too many people sick over a webinar, so hey. So okay, yeah, so today's presentation is the 7 deadly sins of incident response, and we've got quite a bit to talk about, so let's jump right into it.
Cool. Let's hit it. So I suppose I could start off by setting the scene and say how we came about with the whole theme of this sort of webinar around the deadly sins of incident response. And as an analyst, I sit in this privileged position, and I say privileged because I don't get to do any work, but I get to speak to a lot of people who actually do a lot of really good work. So I get a chance to speak to a lot of vendors and incident response providers and sort of like technical solution architects to see what they're seeing. And I also get the opportunity to hear from a whole ton of enterprise users, ones that have been breached and not been breached, and ones in the process of developing their incident response process. And it gives a very good holistic view from both sides of the argument as to what works and what doesn't work. And from that, there were these common sort of trends that kept coming up time and time again as to what really makes poor incident response. Because it's very easy to say, hey, this is what you need to do, and this is great. But these were some of the themes that we looked at, and we felt that these are really some of the key things that hopefully if we share with you, you can avoid committing these sins yourself and saving yourself a lot of heartache and probably cash in the process. So if we jump onto the next slide, you'll see that the very first sort of, and probably in my opinion, one of the most critical sort of sins is where companies don't actually understand the entire environment due to a lack of visibility. And if we were face to face, right now I'd be asking how many of put your hands up, how many of you actually have an up-to-date and accurate sort of like network diagram that you have confidence in that it's up to date. And the responses you get is usually quite low. So just even understanding the entire internal environment is a challenge for lots of enterprises, and that's not really due to laziness or not intent, but we look at large enterprises, particularly they formed over the years as a result of mergers and acquisitions and all sorts of things, and then you have sort of like disruptive technologies in there like virtualization and cloud, and you're not sure whether your north-south traffic is actually east-west traffic or vice versa. So understanding what the infrastructure looks like, understanding assets and things like data classification, or just the whole internal environment. That's one of the first things that we see in incident response, that a breach occurs and people ask, okay, what's happened, where is it happened, how has it happened? And without having that understanding of or visibility of the environment, that becomes quite tricky.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to move on here a little bit, having, I guess, good visibility is important for quite a few reasons, right? One of them is kind of the base whole, you can't respond to something if you don't have any, I guess, historical information, right? And that's kind of one of the closest things that we have to a full stop of incident response. So here we do have 7, maybe 8, depending on how things go, sins to talk about. But having a lack of visibility is kind of the closest thing to a full stop, I think, at least, that we'll talk about. So there's a few important things that having visibility will do for you. So for a lot of people, maybe scratch the actual timestamps here, but for a lot of people, this is what a generic incident looks like. Here you can scratch someone visits a malicious website and say, they got an email with a malicious PDF or something. You can scratch your gateway and call it an IDS or an antivirus system. You call it whatever you like. But typically what happens is an end user gets compromised. Hopefully something recognizes that compromise, right? And then perhaps the administrator runs over and kind of takes that machine off the network. And for a lot of people, that is incident response. Right now, on one hand, being able to do this is probably, quite a bit better than things could be, right, if you couldn't do this. But on the other hand, this isn't really enough, I guess, to be incident response, and that's where this visibility comes in. So to kind of fill in the rest of this timeline, what we see are some things that you kind of might miss without, I guess, having good visibility into your environment. And again, this is just kind of a sample timeline, but after an internal host gets compromised, what you kind of have to be able to answer in order to really say you're doing incident response is what that host did, right? So just recognizing a compromised host and remediating that individual host, I guess, doesn't really do enough to make sure that you resolve an incident properly. But in addition to this, one of the big things that visibility allows you to do is not just be reactive, but kind of be proactive. So what we see here are two lists of types of hosts, right? If you're a stealth user, you might kind of call these things host groups. So knowing kind of what goes on in your environment and being able to see into that allows you to kind of begin to understand how things interact, right? There might be some regular kind of relationships that you'd expect to see here, or of course just a few sample ones, but your developers talking to your code repository is very normal. Your DNS servers talking to the internet, normal. People on the internet talking to your mail servers and your web servers, provided you have them. These are all normal things, right? You kind of want to get to know what normal is, but more importantly, you want to be able to spot what's not normal. For example, are your domain controllers talking to the internet, or are your web servers, talking to your code repository? Now, these seem silly, and these seem like things that likely shouldn't be happening, but it doesn't mean they aren't. Right? When you kind of know your environment, it's not just a matter of having kind of a network diagram like Javvad was talking about, although that's certainly an important part of kind of getting to know what's going on. But you also want to be able to understand these relationships. Again, to find weird ones. And some of these, again, might seem kind of silly, but believe me when I say we seem, I guess, some simple questions that you could ask. For example, do I have ATMs? Are my ATMs talking to the internet? Like, you might think that no, they're not, but if you don't have visibility, you can't validate that, and that's one of the biggest problems that we kind of see people running into. So as far as how to remediate this, I guess there's a few types of network, a few types of network visibility that can really help for that. So there's taking information from your network, for example, NetFlow, telemetry data, right? That gives you very, very broad coverage, audit logs of who's talking to who. You can pull logs from the different types of services your network offers. For example, web proxy logs or DNS logs. And this is very useful, because it gets you, they're kind of choke point services, right? So it gets you a lot of information without having to deploy monitoring very, very widely. And it also helps you to respond in the event those services are used against you, right? For example, DNS amplification attacks. And then finally, you can collect information from all your hosts, right? And there's lots of different devices you can feed them into or display log aggregators. And while these here can give you very specific information about what's going on an individual host, it's something you kind of have to be able to deploy widely. So what we do here is we kind of start by getting broad coverage so we can see as much as we can as soon as we can, and then we can begin to expand for more detail where we feel we need them. So regardless of what you're collecting, there's a few questions you kind of want to ask yourself. And the first is, are you logging information or are you also collecting it? Right? Because having a bunch of active logs on a bunch of servers that no one can really access centrally isn't going to be that much help, especially when you suspect that host has been compromised. Are you saving only special log lines, or are you saving everything? And the trick is, if you could kind of identify special log lines, you would likely never get compromised, right? It's kind of a harder thing to do than a lot of people expect. And then just kind of questions like, do you have a standard retention period in your policy? And what happens when you run out of storage, right? Does the budget control the period, or does the period control the budget? And this is kind of the final question here. If you have end user managed hosts, are they subject to the same logging policy? So in some environments, kind of IT rules all, right? Where in other environments, IT organizations are kind of there for support. So when you're in one of those types of environments, there's something you have to deal with, right? And it's a challenge. There's a challenge you need to be conscious of. So to hand it back over to Javvad before we continue to move on.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite slides, and thanks, Brandon, for actually finding this image for me, because when we were discussing about this, he said, hey, I've got this image, and I was like, that is amazing. That sums up, I think, what lack of visibility does is you're relying on someone like Brian Krebs to publish an article on his website saying, hey, so-and-so company has been breached, and this is what's gone missing. And it's surprising the number of companies that have fallen into that sort of category, where the media have said, hey, we found some files belonging to them, or there's been a breach or something like that. And that's the first they've actually come to know of it. Or the FBI or some other police agency has come knocking on the door with like, we found these servers and it looks like all of your customer data or all your records are on here, or X, Y, Z. And that's the first time a company becomes aware of it. And that's a really awkward place for any company to be in. I mean, it's really embarrassing. It's kind of like, as a parent, if someone comes knocking on my door and says, hey, did you realize your son was outside throwing bricks in car windows or something like that? And I'd be like, yeah. And they give you that look, not that this has happened to me, but, they would give you that look as if like, what kind of parent are you? And, these things happen, but, it's one of those situations that a lot of companies have found themselves in the past. And looking forward, it's like, without that visibility, the potential is that, any company could fall into that situation. So moving on, we will get to the second deadly sin of incident response, and that's to have a bunch of red shirts. If you're not familiar, I assume everyone's familiar, but if you're not familiar with the old TV series Star Trek, there was a joke that all the expendable characters were wearing red shirts. So whenever they'd go down to another planet for an exploration or something, you'd be guaranteed that anyone wearing a red shirt was more likely to die than anyone else, and that was often the case. So the question becomes, like, during times of incident response, do you actually have the right staff to deal with the incident, or are you relying on a bunch of red shirts to come in and kind of like help put out fires or learn as they go along? And this is something that I think Brandon can elaborate on a bit.
Yeah, and to even take a step back a little bit, not just isn't a matter of having the right staff, but sometimes it's a matter, I guess, of having any staff. So we've got a few different sets of statistics that we'll present today. And some of the ones here that mentioned Lancope and the Ponemon Institute come from a report that Lancope commissioned and was carried out by the Ponemon Institute. I believe it was late last year. So to give you a little bit of context behind the numbers that we're going to show you, at least from the Lancope reports, pardon me. So to give you a little bit of context behind these numbers here, just moving my phone over, it told us a little bit quiet, so hopefully that's a bit better. Everyone who got to this point in the survey said that A, they had a fully functional CSIRT, incident response team, and that they were aware of the actions of their CSIRT. In addition, for this question, only, let's see here, it says only 18% of people who responded said their organization was less than 500 employees. So you might be looking at this, maybe if you're part of like a small medium business, right, you have 100, 200 employees, you think, well, of course I don't have a fully staffed, full-time team of 10 people fully dedicated to incident response. This isn't to suggest that you should, but again, a lot of the people who responded here are part of larger organizations. And what we see here is that 35% of people have nobody fully dedicated to incident response. And And even here, 12 plus 16, 28% of people, they have nobody, only one person dedicated between full-time and part-time. And that's kind of an issue. And one of the big reasons that it's an issue, I guess I can explain with this metaphor that I like to use. So kind of incident response, I like to look at sort of the crude oil cycle. And I'm not really an expert on crude oil, so excuse me if I've kind of messed up the metaphor a little bit. But at first, you kind of have the part where you're collecting information from your network. And this is kind of the oil rig out there, right? Taking this crude oil out of the ground. And at that point, it's something valuable, but it can be made a lot more valuable. And the way you do that is by refining it, right? And then selling it and realizing its value. And this is where your people come in, right? So you can have lots of different tools to do lots of different things for you. But what you'd like to have are, I guess, people who have that knowledge of your environment, the knowledge of the threats that you're facing, to begin to look at that information in context and to say, okay, given all this information, kind of we have a good idea of what's going on here, but in order to do that, again, what you need are the people to process that information. So like Javvad was saying, if you have people who, I guess, aren't really experienced or aren't part of a full-time incident response team, you might have some trouble kind of getting the most information, the most value, out of all of the information you're collecting. So to hand it back over to Javvad.
Sure, yeah, so thanks, Brendan. So when we look at the overall trends and we ask companies in more detail as to what are the key sort of main features about staffing, these are like the three sort of points that come up. The first one is actually having the right technical skills for incident response. And it's one of the most common things that, so I initially assumed that, well, you don't have anyone with any security skills or technical security skills. And they're like, no, we have people with security skills. They're not necessarily trained in incident response, or they don't know how to go about making those decisions at that time, or they don't have that technical situational awareness of the environment as a whole, which sort of links back to that initial point about the lack of visibility or understanding the environment. So the technical skills encompasses sort of like a number of skills that the incident responders need to have that, a lot of companies say that they struggle to either identify those skills in the first place as to exactly what's needed, and if they can, then finding the talent and retaining the talent, and as such is the second challenge. Beyond that, knowledge transfer is one of those things that everyone says that they're going to do. They're going to have in place processes and they're going to, document everything. But in reality, majority of companies we see, they just say that they just don't have the time, or it always gets put, it gets deprioritized, and it ends up on the back burner. So, when one of your team members leaves and an incident occurs, or they're on holiday and an incident occurs, and it's like, this affects all those payment systems, and only Bob knew how the payment systems work. You either have to call him back, or you have to disturb him on his holiday, or you just have to try and get someone to make it up as they go along, which just adds to that process. So having appropriate knowledge transfer within the staffing one is the second sort of area that companies say is like needs to be done better. And the third sort of key point is like having the right staff that are appropriate to the type of company that you operate in. And it varies from industry to industry, vertical. It's like the analogy Brandon was giving of the oil company. And I actually worked for a couple of years at an oil and gas company. And I haven't come from banking. I thought, yeah, information security is information security. And I went there, and their whole ethos and the practices were very different, and it took a while to adapt to it. But and that's even more critical when it comes to incident response, because you need decisions to be made based on that particular company's risk appetite, that particular industry's risk appetite, and not having the right staff can lead to sort of like prioritization being given to things that aren't really a business priority, or reporting being done that isn't meaningful. So these are kind of like the areas that we see come up time and time again in terms of staffing.
Okay. Yeah, and one of the other big things to talk about, hopefully I'm a little bit easier to hear now. One of the other big things, I guess that's important to realize, is that your whole incident response process isn't just the technical responders that you have, I guess, chasing down incidents, right, and I guess reading logs and I guess doing the technical work. One of the things that you kind of have to really, I guess, realize is that different departments have to be, I guess, ready to lend a hand when an incident comes about. So this is something else that we saw from the Ponemon survey. We asked people what functions or departments they have involved in the incident response process. And what you can see here is that it's a lot more than just specific people sitting in the incident response room, if you have one. HR is involved, legal is involved, compliance is involved, sometimes even the board and directors and executive management. And one of the teams that we don't have here is PR, right? Because sometimes a breach comes down to that. There's no notifications involved. So it's important that in the event you do show up to legal with some kind of information security incident, or you have to show up to HR for some kind of policy violation, you're not blindsiding them, right? So if you're going to make these people part of your incident response process, you want to make sure it's something they're prepared for, something they have some sort of plan for, if not experience for. So to move on to our third sin here, we have Javvad again.
Cool. So this is the lack of budget. And I think this is representative of economics at the broader scale, where you've got two kind of broad school of thoughts. One is that the budget is very, very sort of like minute with regards to the security needs, and therefore something's always got to give. The other school of thought is that, hey, the budget is actually sufficient to meet your security needs. It's just the allocation that is sort of not done appropriately, which makes it seem as if that the budget isn't enough. And I'm not here to debate what is true and what is not, because that will vary depending on the company. But the underlying theme really comes from it is that budget is typically available. It's the ability to ask for the budget or communicate up the chain to build the business case for that budget that is typically lacking, and it's especially so in terms of incident response. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that this is like taken, the chart is taken from a survey that we done at 451. We have a division called the Improper that does end user sort of like surveys and from senior security buyers and IT buyers as a whole. And more than half of the companies about half of the companies, they're increasing their spend on security. So, security has been on this upward curve for the last few years anyway. Yet, the actual sort of allocation to incident response or the effectiveness of incident response doesn't seem to reflect it, because it's one of those industries where money's been poured in at a growing rate, yet at the same rate we see this growing number of breaches that occur in more and more companies. And so going back to that communication, it's like, are companies communicating technical terms that the business doesn't understand, and are they helping the business to understand whether they're helping them to sell more widgets? And the Home Depot example comes to mind on this, is that after their point systems were sort of like compromised and they were hacked and what have you, some people said that, hey, the security team actually raised these issues to management before, and their response was, well, we just sell hammers. And that's fine, and that's perfectly true for a business. So what was really actually that probably, and I wasn't internal, this is just like from what we see publicly. I mean, maybe the internal conversations were different, but maybe the security team wasn't presenting the value of the investment that would help them to sell more hammers. If you can help your company sell more hammers, you will get the money for it. That's typically how a business works. So budget is ineffective in its allocation because of the lack of understanding or the perception of the value that will bring. So, if you want better investment in incident response, which is often seen as like, one of the ways that you can build up the team and you can get more better visibility, that business case needs to be made accordingly. But what we end up seeing is because of the way that communication is poor, the way in which the security team's efficiency is measured is quite unscientific in many ways. And on the next slide, we can see that we asked companies like, how do you measure the efficiency of your security team? And if we start from like, the third sort of like biggest response, which was, hey, we don't use any significant metrics. We just like, just get a gut feel as to whether the company, whether the security team is efficient or not. And the second sort of response was the lack of breaches. And it's kind of like one of those, there's a website, I can't remember what, it's tylervision.com, I think. It's spurious correlations, where they take completely unrelated facts and you can correlate them together. So they have things like, number of people who died by drowning in a swimming pool correlates exactly to number of Nicolas Cage films released over the last 10 years. And that metric is kind of like one of those ones. You're just equating a lack of breaches with, hey, that must mean that whatever we invested in incident response or security as a whole is being effective. And there's no real causation there. It's just a spurious correlation. So I'll let Brandon dive into sort of like some more elements of this.
Yeah, so to chip in there before we move on to slides, it's also kind of funny because one of the reasons you have an incident response team is to discover these breaches when they occur, right? So if you're not discovering breaches, it doesn't mean necessarily that there aren't any. It may, but what it also might mean is that if there are, you just haven't found them, right? So again, it's kind of a funny, I guess, a funny metric to use. But just to kind of show some of our survey data, that speaks to what Javvad was saying. Here we asked people how much of your security budget goes towards an incident response program. And this included personnel, services, and technology. So you'll have to excuse me here. The percentages by the graph show the, not the responses, but the percentage of people who responded to each bucket. But what we see here is that 50% of people said less than 10% of their security budgets, which, like Javvad says here, are growing. They're spending less than 10% of them on incident response, and 81% of people said less than 21% of these budgets. So it's not a matter necessarily of the fact that there isn't a security budget. It's just that incident response isn't where people are kind of focusing them. So as far as metrics goes, we asked a few people about this as well during our Ponemon survey. And what we saw here is we have two different questions, but in both cases, 50% and above of respondents said they weren't using any significant, meaningful operational metrics. And this is kind of a problem, because like Javvad was kind of hinting at earlier, not hinting at, he was saying earlier, was that you need a good way to, I guess, communicate what it is you're doing, right? Just being specific about, I guess, the technical details often isn't enough when you're speaking to someone who doesn't understand them, or it's not what they do. But instead, we're kind of not showing anything tangible, right? That's something that people can kind of hang on to get a better understanding of how a team is performing and what a team is doing. But it's also sometimes simpler than that. So one of the questions from our survey was about the frequency of briefings to various functions within the organization. And I'm not suggesting that you need to meet with your board of directors every week, right? But what we're seeing here is that a lot of times, especially above IT management, executives aren't really kind of briefed on what's going on for IT security, right? So if it's something that they're not hearing about, and kind of the metric they're using is the fact that they haven't heard there's a breach, they're not really familiar enough with what it is that's going on. And again, the hard part here can be translating from the tech speak, I guess, or the technical detail, to something that kind of fits more of the way that your executives are thinking, right? But the conversation has to happen at all for that to be the issue. So it's something we kind of wanted to highlight with some of the statistics we've seen from our surveys.
Cool. So the fourth deadly sin. Companies tend to become headless chickens when an actual incident does occur. And this is something that, you know, and a lot of it depends on when it's detected and how it's been reported. So if it was really Brian Krebs publishing it and, you know, you being made aware that way, that's kind of like, you know, it's expected there'll be a degree of panic, but that's where the plan should then kick in, and, you know, there should be something structured. And the funny thing is that this actually also been reported to happen in companies that even when they do have a plan. And it reminds me of a Mike Tyson quote that where he said that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that that's so true when it comes to incident response, that, you know, we see companies, they have a plan in place. They say, okay, this is what the chain of command will look like. Yet an incident happens, and then you get some executives really panic and they jump in, and, you know, they want to make some decisions. So the typical things that we see that, you know, go wrong in this process are on the next slide, which is the reporting lines and the roles become undefined or very unclear at times of incidents. So even where companies have done tabletop top exercises, they might not have them up to date. So people that were involved then are no longer there, or departments that were meant to be involved have been renamed as part of a restructure. And no one knows who's really in charge, who do they need to report to, what element do they have to do. And we even have incidents of, like, you know, some people say, hey, there's always some hero in there who wants to run the same queries that someone else is running because they've got those forensic skills or investigative skills, but without realizing that someone else is already doing that. So it's kind of like wasted effort. And then we get those knee-jerk reactions and decisions being made because, hey, on Twitter it's all blowing up, and someone's, you know, people are saying some bad things, and we're trending and as a hashtag, and, you know, quick, we need to do something to make this go away. And the third thing that we see come out from that is, you know, there's lack of change management or lack of documented process that goes into a lot of incident response. So you might be able to put out the fires and you might be able to get systems back up and running, but then the next morning someone says, okay, do we have a list of all the changes we actually made, and can we validate that they were correct, and we haven't, like, just enabled any rules on all our firewalls just to make sure the business is up and running again. And that's where companies say, you know what, we kind of, like, you know, used a bazooka to kill a fly right there, and we're left with a big gaping hole in our building.
Yes, to build on that a bit, there's a quote here that's, you know, not exactly Vince Lombardi, but close enough. You know, when you get into an incident investigation, you want to act like you've been there before. So this is kind of not holding true to the initial context of the quote at all, but it's one that I kind of thought, I guess, given our modifications here, made sense to discuss, right? Because one of the things that's super important in the middle of an investigation, like Javvad was saying, is to kind of have, you know, I guess a plan is one way to say it, but to have answered a lot of the questions you're going to want to ask beforehand, right? And this is one of kind of the biggest things in the middle of an investigation, is that, especially, let's say either A, if it's the first time you're doing one, you're going to have a lot of questions come up that you're not going to be able to answer within the time frame you need those answers in. So one thing that's not always practical is to have, you know, a run book for every possible situation, right? To say, if X happens, then we will Y. It's good to be able to kind of start that out, especially for some of the more common things you may face. But it's not practical to have that for everything. But instead, what you kind of want to do is to begin to ask some of those higher level, I guess, foundational questions. And one of the biggest ones that I've seen is deciding who can approve what, right? And then beginning to kind of follow that train of thought to ask all the questions that would come afterwards. But again, it is very, very, very important to know who can approve what. Because when an incident comes up, especially, again, if you're not an organization that deals with things like this very frequently, what you're going to find is that you're going to want to do things that you haven't thought about, right? And this is an extreme example, but it's just pulling something off the top of my head. But if something comes out and you want to, pull the plug out of your production web server, or you want to pull your entire environment offline, and again, I'm not suggesting those are necessarily the way to, I guess, to respond to every incident by any means, but you want to know who is empowered to make the call to do that. And you also want to know what happens if you can't reach, I guess, the person empowered with the ability to make those decisions. In addition, you want to know how you're going to deal with your users or your end users. For example, are people required to give their machines over to the incident response team? And this seems like kind of a silly question, but something I've seen quite a fair bit. Someone saying that, I think X's machine has been compromised, but I don't really have the ability to go take it from them, right? It's not something I can do. Or in the event that you need to, I guess, wipe someone's computer out, you decide it's been compromised, do they get anything back? If you are going to give them back some things, how do you make the decision on what they do get back? If the CSIRT's blocked something, but a user says it's absolutely critical, what are you going to do to decide whether or not they can have that back? So there's lots of questions that, again, when they get asked, they typically require quick answers. But if it's the first time they're being asked, there's a good chance you're not willing to get back with those answers in time. So just to kind of go over some of the other high-level ones for the sake of time, some of the things that you'll want to consider are your external obligations, right? Like whatever laws are in your state, your country, the types of compliance that you adhere to, any partner contractual obligations that you have. Breach is a very special word for a lot of people, right? Because once you use the word breach, it becomes a thing. Not that an incident isn't a thing, but a lot of times, like I said, a breach has laws involved, right? Once a breach happens, we have to do all of these things, right? So for you, at what point does an event actually become a breach? And finally, just a couple other things that you want a CSIRT to know. For example, can they share indicators when something happens? Can they run malware on the internet? A lot of these things are questions that, again, will come up, and you'd like to have the answers before they do in order to, again, avoid kind of running around like that chicken without a head, because, again, if these are things that you're not doing frequently, it's very easy to overlook the fact that these will be very important and time-critical questions.
Right, so sin number 5 is the use of generic processes that aren't specific to your organization. And it's really easy to just go and Google and find a standard for incident response. So you might find the NIST standard 861, I think, which is like, hey, this is how you do computer security incident response. And that's great, but it's a very generic standard, and just having that written down somewhere is not really sufficient. And the Bruce Lee quote came to me about be like water. If you're in the cup, take the form of the cup. If it's in a jug, it takes the form of the jug. And standards and the actual incident response processes need to be tailored towards that particular organization. And so when generic responses or when generic sort of standards are used, we end up with kind of like these 3 high-level bullet points, whereby firstly, it fosters that monkeys in a cage mentality. And it's that story where, you put a bunch of monkeys, 5 monkeys in a cage, and you put a banana at the top, and if anyone reaches for it, you spray all of them with cold water. So eventually over time they realize, hey, if we go for that banana, we get sprayed, so no one goes for it. And then they take out one of the monkeys and put in a dry monkey. And as soon as that monkey goes for the banana, the rest of the monkeys beat him up. And they go through this, and eventually they replace all the wet monkeys with dry monkeys. So none of them have ever been sprayed with water, but still when a monkey goes for a banana, the others beat them up. And that's kind of like how a lot of security best practices are implemented. It's like, hey, that's what we've heard has been done all the time, or that's what's worked for all of these companies, without putting a thought into is this actually tailored for our company? Is it appropriate for our company? And taking it that way. So that's why, you have that lack of tailoring that goes into it. So when an incident does occur, you're left following processes that aren't aren't necessarily specific. And, you know, everything is kind of like risk-based. You know, you implement security controls based on where you think your critical assets are, and your response should be based on where your critical assets are and what you're giving priority. A completely e-commerce based sort of like online company will have completely different valuation of their online assets compared to a company that's still very much brick and mortar but have an online presence. So, you know, these things all need to be taken into consideration when developing an incident response plan. Otherwise, you just fall into that monkeys in a cage mentality. And I say that with all due respect.
So to move on a little bit, something I wanted to highlight was that in the last section, we kind of outlined some questions that were very useful and important to ask. But that's what they were, right? They were questions that you kind of had to ask yourself, ask of your environment, ask of your team. And the reason for that was because for a lot of them, there isn't really a standard right answer, right? So like Javvad was talking about, there's lots of broad scale best practices, right? For example, different sets of compliance rules. And what the purpose of, I guess the purpose that a lot of these different things serve is that they're often better than nothing, right? There's things that people can try to apply broadly. But in order to really refine that, what you do want to do is look at these different policy use procedures in the context of your environment and ask yourself those questions. Because again, your answer might not look the same as mine or somebody else's, but that's because your environment doesn't. So what you want to do is make sure you answer those contextually, right? Let's say you move from environment to environment. There's a very good chance that those answers change, along with, I guess, the places that you're working. You know what I mean? So it's not just one set of universal right answers. It's very important to look at them in the context of where you are. So in addition, I guess like Javvad was saying, what you need to do is figure out exactly what's actually right for you. So as an example, I've seen certain places where the CSIRT could do nothing but make recommendations. And I've seen certain places where the CSIRT was practically able to make acquisitions and make business decisions. And that's kind of an exaggeration, kind of a joke. But in that case, what I mean is that the CSIRT was able to kind of rule with the iron fist, right? Whatever they said went. And neither one of these is necessarily right or wrong, but context is the key. So the most important question that I suggest you think about, you ask yourself, is whether your CSIRT should be making decisions or recommendations. Because on one hand, I guess a lot of us here are in security, right? Often a breach kind of seems like the worst thing in the world. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the times it's not. But when you kind of have that investment in it, it really, I guess, seems like a lot more than it is. So sometimes it's kind of valuable to have someone who's informed, but not on the front line of the CSIRT to approve certain actions, right? Let's say, I recognize this is an issue, but we can't pull this box offline for this type of incident. Again, I recognize it's a security problem, but it's not big enough given the business context that's going on here. On the other hand, requiring upper management approval for every step a CSIRT takes is going to limit their effectiveness, right? Things are going to take too long. There's a lot of things that won't be able to get done. And kind of beyond that, for those of us who work in incident response teams, one of the worst feelings is having an incident you think is significant on your hands, but not being able to reach a decision maker and not knowing what they'd approve, right? So beginning to understand, having, I guess, rules of engagement, I guess is maybe the right term here, for your CSIRT is very, very helpful, very, very valuable. But again, it's a question that's very personal to your environment. It's one that needs to be answered in that way.
Cool. So the sixth thing we see is just complete and utter, improper threat modeling or none done whatsoever. And one of the analogies I use to describe this often is, at least here in Britain, there's a common thing where, like, if you have a garage in your house, you normally use it to store all your junk. And your car is normally out on the drive or on the road. Like, so your 50,000 BMW will be out on the road and all your junk will be locked in the secure garage next to your house. And that's like, when you think about it, it's like, wow, who actually thought of that? That's like such a, an upside down way of doing it. And that's kind of like how a lot of companies typically do their threat modeling. They don't actually think about what their assets are, how they're going to protect it, and what that's going on. So, some of the key things that we see on the next slide about the incorrect threat modeling is like you tend to miss the big picture. I mean, some companies get so fixated on certain aspects of, hey, we are PCI, we need to be PCI compliant in this environment, so let's put all of our controls there and let's like have, really good incident response processes in place to protect that, yet, missing that overall value of the organization and, where the real IP actually is. And that leads to a lot of it is like emotional-based decision-making or just convenience-based decision-making. And, if your car's never been keyed or never been broken into, you're very happy. Yeah, I've left it out on the street or on the driveway for a few years and nothing's happened. But the day something does happen, then it's like, oh, let me clear out my garage, let me put my car in there, and let me start putting CCTV cameras up and what have you. But it's kind of late at that point. You want to try and get to a point where that happens, where you put in place the right controls beforehand. And the other sort of like mentality that is somewhat damaging is the feeling that you have to defend against every single possible threat scenario all the time, and that's kind of like not what risk management is all about. And it certainly like isn't you're not there to have that happening in incident response. Otherwise, you'd have teams being deployed every time you get a DLP alert because someone's plugged in an unencrypted USB into their laptop. So these are things that I think are some of the most important ones that come out time and time again.
Yeah, and especially towards the last point, defending against everything all the time. There's, I guess, a few different ways to look at that, and one of them is the time expense, right? So you probably don't have, you probably don't have the time and the resources to do absolutely everything, right? There's a lot of things that needs to be done, and a lot of these things consume a lot of time. So it would be nice to have specific mitigations and prepare responses for everything. But again, that's often impractical. So whether you're kind of a one-person part-time CSIRT or kind of a fully staffed team, the person hours that you have are typically, I guess, one of your most precious resources. So the odds that you've kind of got a grasp of what's going on, the odds are that if you've got a good grasp of what's going on, there's no shortage of things, I guess, that you have to spend time on. So one of the best ways to kind of decide what gets your time is to do, like Javvad is saying here, proper threat modeling, right? To understand what poses the biggest risks to you. I guess given the type of organization that you have, the type of threats that you face, and the type of setups that you have. And in addition, it's not just a matter of time, but it's also a matter of, I guess, where you make compromise. So being in IT security and incident response, one of the most valuable things that you can offer is kind of determining where to compromise and accept risk. So organizations have IT because they need IT, right? They need email, they need web browsing, they need the services that come along with it. So along with that comes risk, but you need to accept some of it, right? You can't just not have IT. So, if you're lucky enough to be in an organization where people seek out your input, you need to be very, very conscious of that to make those compromises, because it's very easy to find some degree of risk in anything, right? But what's more difficult and more valuable is to be able to kind of weigh that risk against the threats that you face and the needs that it has. And again, a big part of that is threat modeling. So like it says here, the safest network is one with nothing connected, right? So if you make it your policy that nobody can use your network, A, they'll go around you, or B, they'll just get rid of you, right? So it's not really something practical. So what we need to be able to do is figure out what risks we accept and kind of where we try to avoid them. And threat modeling is the way to do that. So our final sin here, to hand it back over to Javvad.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we're just about there. We've spoken a lot about the process side of things and the people, the staffing, and what have you. And this thing is really more geared towards the technology side. And people often complain, hey, we bought that blinky box, we've stuck it in, and nothing happened. And the truth of the matter is, in large, complex environments, you need to tune and you need to hone the products that you buy and install, and you need to make sure it's appropriate for your environment as a whole. So if you don't consider your environment and capabilities when you are tuning your devices, you can lead to, like, alert overload. And alert overload, I think, is something that a lot of companies are well aware of. I remember back in the day, I used to do some IDS monitoring, and it was just horrendous. I mean, you couldn't really separate the news from the noise, as they say. And one of the problems really is, like, people just set it in default mode and just forget it. It's like, hey, this is what the manufacturer's recommended settings are. Okay, let's just get it working and we'll come back to do it. And, it's like the monitoring of the quality of alerts is sort of like secondary, and people just end up counting stuff because it's easy to be counted. It's like saying, hey, our email server blocked, 2 million suspicious spam emails this month. Well, okay, what does that mean? Independently, it doesn't mean much. And this leads to shelfware, where a product is either not used or underutilized altogether. And I done this piece of research last year on shelfware, and then so the question was like, hey, why do you find products end up on the shelf? Why, IT security products are meant to be, some of them make really good claims, and some of them are really good. And if you look at some of the responses here, it's like, hey, lack of staff or internal politics got in the way, not enough time to implement it properly. And these are sort of like themes that are consistent from, both the customer side and vendor side when you ask them, hey, why wasn't your product used? Or you're like, hey, we only purchased it because we had compliance budget to say, buy this WAF and stick it there, and and never put it in active block mode or what have you. But if you don't take these into consideration, then you're going to end up with a lot of kit that's not doing much, and it only makes your life a lot harder when it comes to incident response.
Yeah, so just I guess a few things to consider and address when you are tuning your devices. So we skipped ahead a little bit there, and I'm sorry about that. But a few of these questions, or I guess just ideas, is that first, tuning is kind of an iterative process, right? So when you have events, rules, alarms that are giving you an issue, typically there's going to be a few rounds of changes that you need, right, in order to get them to where you want them to be, and that's something to keep in mind. In addition, you want to think about what sort of setup you're working to. So earlier we looked at the fact that there are some people out there, with a one-person part-time CSIRT. Right. I suspect that these are the types of teams or organizations that don't want to chase down a bunch of events per day. What they want is, when something really happens, when something critical happens, to know so that they can spring into action. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a full-time staffed CSIRT or full-time staffed SOC, you have the ability to have people analyze these events. So what you have to decide is which one of these you want to be. Right. So again, it is nice to, in an ideal situation, you never have an event fire or a rule fire that isn't dead on something that requires action, malicious. But until you get to that point, you need to kind of work on this slider. And in addition, you want to think about using your detection tools to kind of supplement your environmental knowledge, right? So as an example, let's say, one of your monitoring systems can look for port scans, right, or address scans. And maybe this becomes a noisy event that you don't really care about, right, because people will scan your DMZ all day, every day, all the time, right? That's not something you care about. It just becomes a noisy event. That's not very useful. But on the other hand, if a host inside your LAN begins scanning your internal ranges, that's a lot more indicative of something weird going on. So what you can do is you can use this kind of port scan event, right, as a tool to say, hey, I know when I do and don't care about this, and that is when I will kind of use this event, right? So you want to look at your events in the context of what you know about your environment. And finally, you kind of want to familiarize yourself with the rules, events, or alarms that you do turn on, right? So something that I kind of often say and often think is that the best rule is one that you wrote yourself, right? Because you know how it works. You get to know when it doesn't. You know what it means and what to do when it happens, right? You understand it inside and out. And that's a very, very good thing. That's, to me, kind of one of the things that makes a good event, right? You trust it and you know how to handle it. But you don't write all of the events for all of your products, right? So you want to try and get as close to that point as possible. You want to know what events you've got on and what they are and what they do. In addition, you kind of want to learn which events are your money events, right? The ones that you trust, you respond to as soon as they go off. Then what you want to do is kind of figure out why the other ones aren't in that bucket. Are they an event for something you don't care about? For example, an IDS event to say that somebody went to Dropbox. If you don't care, maybe you don't leave it on, right? It contributes to all that noise. On the other hand, if it's kind of a threshold thing, what you do is, I guess, take note of why you don't really care when that event goes off, and then use that to revisit and to tune. So we've gotten to the end here. We've got a few more minutes. So Javvad, you want to break out our kind of bonus spin here, I guess?
Yeah, this is where I do my Columbo and go, hey, just one more thing. Yeah, that's a horrible accent. I apologize. So yeah, I think one of the themes that you probably would have picked up on throughout this is that everything's incident response isn't a cookie cutter approach. It's not generic. It's very much tailored to your enterprise, your risk appetite, the staff you have, the technology sort of stack you run. So take advantage of previous incidents, and that's something that not many companies take as much advantage of as they could have. It's like your best source of threat intelligence or learnings is like, hey, what happened? Last year when that incident happened, we had an outage there. If you gather all of that and if you can document all of that and if you have that to hand, that will be far more valuable to you than any other sort of like source of intelligence that you could gather.
That's exactly right. So just one or two last stats here before we wrap up. This also came from our Panama study. What we saw here was that 65% of people said that threat feeds were either effective or very effective tools in helping to detect breaches. There were more responses here, but these were just the top 4. And the reason I show you that is to then show you this. So what we found was that 54 to 57% of people, 3% of those being unsure, said that their organization's incident investigations resulted in threat indicators that weren't actually used to defend the organization in the future. So to me, this is crazy, and actually, I don't want to call it my favorite, but one of the stats that I thought was most interesting out of the whole report. And that's because this immediately tells me, that, again, between 54 and 50% of people weren't getting, I guess, the maximum value out of their incident response teams. So one of the main things your incident response team can do is, produce valuable and accurate information about what happened in an event. But a second, I guess, item of value there is that they can help you learn from the events that you have and then use those to bolster defenses as you go forward. So the reason I showed you the threat feed stat was to say that a lot of people view those as effective. So what you kind of want to do is you want to think about using your own indicators as a threat feed, but the best threat feed in the world, right? Because these are indicators that are specific to the threats and actors and pieces of malware that are attacking you. So if you're not making use of this information, you're throwing away tons and tons of value. Because people, when they think of the most kind of ninja, attackers, of course they wouldn't reuse IP addresses, email addresses, hashes, but they definitely do. It's something we see all of the time.